Hello, and welcome to Revolutions. Episode 21, The Guns of Ticonderoga. So we left off last time with Britain and her American colonies more or less on the brink of war. And indeed, over the winter of 1774-75, there were multiple opportunities for the war to break out. But being civilized 18th century gentlemen, everyone decided it was best to wait for spring to really get down to business. The various opportunities for the war to break out, and indeed the one that finally did the trick, were all related to General Thomas Gage's attempt to bring all the guns and powder in New England under his control. Town militias would often store their guns and ammunition in collective caches, and the winter of 1774-75 was basically a race to see who could withdraw the powder from those caches first, without provoking the other side to start shooting. So prior to Lexington and Concord, there were three big incidents of this type. The first, known as the Powder Alarm, occurred on September the 1st, 1774, so this is actually just before the First Continental Congress met. The British regulars were able to secretly and peacefully secure what was left in the powder house northwest of Boston. The next day, thousands of militiamen turned out, fueled on by exaggerated rumors that the war was on. But when the rumors didn't pan out, they all dispersed. The second incident, known as the Portsmouth Alarm, involved the colonial militiamen actively seizing the cache at Fort William and Mary in mid-December, with shots fired in the process, arguably the first shots fired in the Revolutionary War. Finally, we have the Salem Alarm in February 1775, which ended when the British regiment sent to lock up the Salem powder ran into a wall of militia that forced them to turn back empty-handed. Now, like I say, any one of these could have turned ugly enough to have really marked the beginning of the war. But in the end, the peace held until April 1775, when the Concord powder was next on the list. Which brings us to Lexington, Concord, and the shot heard round the world, which I am not going to talk about right now. As some of you know, in the interim between the end of the history of Rome and the beginning of revolutions, I was in grad school, where I took a documentary filmmaking class, the final project for which wound up being a video about Lexington, Concord, and the shot heard round the world. So in lieu of talking about it here, I have embedded that video at revolutionspodcast.com. But before you watch it, here is what you need to know. First, the video functions as a pilot episode for a proposed series called Legend Has It that compares historical myth to historical reality. So that's the thematic framework. Second, it is in every way a student film. The production values are low, particularly when it comes to the audio. Third, there are a few little flubs along the way, like when at one point I accidentally refer to Longfellow as Wadsworth. Fourth, as the sleep deprivation mounted, the tone became increasingly silly, and there will be, I'm sure, things that either come too fast to be caught, or just make no sense at all. It will, for example, help if you've seen the old 1970s Incredible Hulk series, and I'm not kidding about that. Fifth, I think that's it. So, enjoy. It's all in good fun, so let's say we don't take too critical a sledgehammer to it. But that's where you need to go for all of the endlessly fascinating details about Lexington, Concord, and the shot heard round the world. For our purposes right now, though, what you need to know is that the quote-unquote battles at Lexington and Concord marked the beginning of the American Revolutionary War, or if you prefer, the American War of Independence. Now, these skirmishes were easily packaged by colonial leaders as purely defensive engagement, which was important to keep moderate patriots from falling into the Loyalist camp. But unfortunately for those concerned with such optics, the initiative taken by a couple of hundred zealous militiamen in upstate New York could enjoy no such packaging. I am talking here about Ethan Allen, Benedict Arnold, and the capture of Fort Ticonderoga. Fort Ticonderoga had been built on the southwest side of Lake Champlain by the French in 1755, but it was seized by the British a few years later. By 1775, the fort was in a sorry state, garrisoned by 2 officers, 48 soldiers, and some dilapidated walls. Early in May, the hulking, boisterous, but surprisingly intellectual Ethan Allen got it into his head to make a play at the fort, as it lay on the most direct route for a possible British invasion from Canada, or, conversely, might serve as a useful staging ground for any invasion by the Americans into Canada. Ethan Allen was originally from Connecticut, but in the years before the Revolution he had made a name for himself as the leader of independent-minded settlers in the New Hampshire Grants, what is today the state of Vermont. New York claimed the territory, but the settlers refused to recognize their authority. Colonel Allen, as he was then popularly known, actually carried a price on his head by the government of New York for his work leading the Green Mountain Boys, a well-organized militia focused almost exclusively on convincing New York that it wasn't worth the trouble to try and govern them. So when the fighting broke out down in Massachusetts, the Green Mountain Boys, though small, were one of the most experienced and disciplined of the colonial militias, and Allen aimed to turn their skills now against the British. But Ethan Allen was not the only one who had his eye on Ticonderoga. The other man who was at that same moment itching to take the fort was the now infamous Benedict Arnold. Also originally from Connecticut, the 34-year-old Arnold came from wealthy Rhode Island stock. He was athletic, charming, and pretty uniformly successful at whatever he put his mind to. He was an early and active supporter of colonial resistance, and when the storm clouds really started brewing, he was elected to the Connecticut militia in March 1775. After Lexington and Concord, he approached the Massachusetts Committee of Safety, which had been set up as a sort of patriot shadow government, and asked for a commission to go organize and capture Ticonderoga, a commission he was granted. Arnold then struck north, and on May the 10th he came across Ethan Allen and Allen's 200-odd troops and promptly declared himself in command. Allen, of course, scoffed at this, but luckily both men wanted the same thing and wanted it as soon as possible, so they agreed to immediately attack the fort. Now, there is no such thing as a Battle of Ticonderoga. The garrison was literally surprised in their beds, and outnumbered 4-1, put up no resistance. The garrison commander quickly negotiated the surrender and safe passage for his men and the 24 women and children living with them. So without firing a shot, the fort was secure. Though its strategic value was never quite what it might have been, the capture of Ticonderoga was absolutely critical to the early days of the war for one very important reason. When Allen and Arnold took stock, they discovered that Ticonderoga held a fairly enormous cache of artillery, including small 4-pound guns, mortars, howitzers, and huge 24-pound guns, plus ammunition for all of it. As we are about to see, these are the guns that Washington will use to fortify Dorchester Heights and drive the British out of Boston. Coincidentally enough, May the 10th also happened to be the day that the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. Now, as you will recall, the first Congress had disbanded back in October 1774, set on a plan of economic resistance. This second Congress was probably planned to do nothing more than check back in and get geared up for the non-exportation phase of the plan that would begin in September. But of course, fate had now dealt them a very different hand. Many of the delegates at the Second Congress were holdovers from the first, but there were now a few new faces, including John Hancock, the recently returned to America Benjamin Franklin, and before too long the young Virginia intellectual Thomas Jefferson. This Second Congress had to deal first and foremost with the question of how to respond to the fighting in Massachusetts. It was almost universally agreed that they should help organize an armed defense of the colonies. But to what end was now the great question. Is this merely to secure a just reconciliation, or are we embarked on the road to independence? This, for example, is where John Dickinson morphs from radical to conservative, not because he changed, but because the times changed, and he is about to become the leading opponent of American independence. The Congress spent the first few weeks of its life debating what it meant by armed defense. Are we simply going to coordinate action by the militias, or are we going to form an independent, let's call it a continental army? In the midst of this, news from Ticonderoga arrived, which made it harder to argue that the colonies were just defending themselves, and helped introduce some friction, as Ticonderoga was in New York, and no one from New York had even been told about the operation that was, oh by the way, led by a man they were trying to throw in jail. But they all mostly got over it, and by the end of May, a consensus was forming around the idea of creating and supplying an independent continental army to first augment and then hopefully supersede the local militias. There were a few men present who had their eye on commanding this new army, most famously John Hancock, but there wasn't really any question who the commission would go to. It absolutely had to be George Washington, who knew enough about the role Providence had ordained for him to show up at the first session of Congress in full military uniform. Okay, so George Washington. George Washington was born in Virginia in February 1732 into a gentry family of the middle tier, doing well, but not in that upper crust of the Virginia planter aristocracy. His father died when he was a teenager, so it fell to his older brother Lawrence to become his main guiding influence. It was Lawrence's connection to the enormously powerful Fairfax family that got Washington his first job as a county surveyor at the age of 17. Now, I must of course mention that yes, this is the same Fairfax family as our old friend Sir Thomas Fairfax, whose title had passed to a cousin after his death in 1671, and then it was handed down to the line to the now 6th Earl of Fairfax, who pretty much owns more land in Virginia than anyone. This same Fairfax clan will also provide young George with his first love, Sally Fairfax. So, connections between our revolutions abound. Anyway, when Lawrence died in 1752, George inherited his estates, including a spot on the Potomac called Mount Vernon. Young George soon developed a passion for the two things that would come to dominate his life: land speculation and military service. He finagled a commission as a major in the Virginia militia, and as tensions with France mounted, he wound up being the guy assigned to head a small expedition in 1753 into the Ohio Valley to politely tell the French to get the hell out. The next year, he was ordered back into the valley with vague instructions to defend the frontier, and he wound up encountering and getting whipped pretty badly by a mix of French and Indians at the small but thoroughly, let's call it instructive, Battle of Fort Necessity. When the French and Indian War finally broke out, Washington was present at, but managed to survive Braddock's disastrous march in 1755, despite the bullets flying every which way, a lucky habit Washington would enjoy his entire life. Tales of his various adventures, though they were not all that successful, circulated through the colonies, and Washington became the closest thing America had to a military hero. This earned him a commission as a colonel, though critically, this was all still within the ranks of the militia, not the regular army, and it was around this point that he really started to chafe under the presumed superiority of regular officers, like when, for example, some captain tried to give him orders. He spent the rest of the war leading 1,000 militiamen defending the Virginia frontier, a period during which he developed his rather intense loathing of militiamen, who he would forever consider unreliable, undisciplined, insubordinate, and cowardly, because he spent as much time tracking down deserters as he did fighting the French. After the war, Washington married the enormously wealthy widow Martha Custis, which is how he pole vaulted from the middling rank to one of the richest men in the American colonies, and how he became the owner of well over 200 slaves. As the pre-revolutionary pressure built, Washington was focused mainly on running his estates, acquiring new property, and keeping his creditors at bay because, like all good Virginia planters, he ran on borrowed money. He also took up his place in the Virginia House of Burgesses, and long dissatisfied with British arrogance both militarily and economically, he soon fell in with the more radically inclined leaders, and as you'll recall, he was a prime mover behind the non-importation response to the Townshend Acts. As the crisis reached its boiling point, he was appalled by the Intolerable Acts, was a delegate to the First Continental Congress, and is now a delegate to the Second Continental Congress, though he will soon be leaving for Boston, as the Congress duly bestowed upon America's most famous soldier the title of Commander-in-Chief of all colonial forces. In the meantime, the so-called triumvirate of reputation had already arrived in Boston. The three men who will wind up leading the British campaigns during the Revolutionary War: Generals William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne, who we will deal with in turn as they each move to center stage. For the moment, however, General Thomas Gage is still in charge. And after Lexington and Concord, Gage, in consultation with his new military advisors, had studied the options and by the end of May determined that they would fortify the heights around Boston and planned to begin in earnest in mid-June. But word soon leaked to the Committee of Safety, and they ordered Artemus Ward, farmer and veteran of the French and Indian War, and the man now leading the combined New England militia stationed in Cambridge, to go occupy Bunker Hill and Dorchester Heights, which commanded the north and south of Boston respectively. There is a map of colonial Boston posted at revolutionspodcast.com, so you can follow along at home. Now, Dorchester Heights will remain for the moment off the board, but on June 16th, Ward ordered William Prescott to take just over 1,000 men from Cambridge over to occupy Bunker Hill, which, if you don't have the map in front of you, was located on a peninsula that hangs out over Boston that also contains the now empty city of Charlestown. The men weren't ready to go until 9 p.m., and so this all winds up being a night operation. When they got out to the peninsula, Prescott decided to fortify Breed's Hill instead. It was slightly lower, but better situated to repel a British advance. The men spent all night digging, and when dawn broke, they had a pretty nice redoubt in place. When the British Navy caught sight of the rebel fortifications the next morning, they opened fire, but the angle was all wrong, and they did minimal damage. That said, by noon on June the 17th, the militiamen were exhausted and discouraged that they had not been relieved yet, and despite their good work on Breed's Hill, all likely flanking routes were still perilously unguarded, and Prescott begged Ward to send more men. Meanwhile, General Gage, awoken by the Navy blasts, selected the east side of the peninsula as the best place to land, which was all well and good, except that meant waiting for the tides, and the 1,500 regulars, led by William Howe, didn't put to shore until around 1 o'clock. More shelling of the rebels followed, as did further reinforcements for both sides. Howe then divided his troops, now numbering over 2,000, into 3 columns, designed to envelop the defenses on Breed's Hill, with the left serving as a diversion to allow the main flanking move to come over from the right. But unfortunately for the British, not only was the ground more difficult than they were prepared for, but the 200 militiamen guarding the hastily fortified fence line guarding the right waited until the approaching regulars were just 50 yards away and then started blasting, killing at least 100 pretty much instantly, and the British were forced to fall back. Now, this would be where I mention the most famous order given in the battle, that the militiamen ought not fire until you can see the whites of their eyes to protect their limited ammunition. But this order has been variously attributed to different officers at different points in the battle, and was probably never even said at all. So there. A second attempt soon followed, again aiming simultaneously at the fence line and the redoubt. But again, the approaching regulars marching smartly were wide-open targets for the colonials, as Howe elected not to go by the book and attack in a narrow column because, man, this is not supposed to be that hard. Anyway, the second attempt also failed, but by now Prescott and his men were basically out of ammunition. So a half an hour later, reinforced by another 400 men, Howe ordered the third assault. No more messing around, just a strong push right up Breed's Hill. It was a grisly business, but it did the trick, especially since the Americans were now officially out of ammunition. The regulars poured into the redoubt, and the militiamen scrambled back to Bunker Hill to regroup. As the redoubt was taken, the Revolution gets its first martyred war hero, as Dr. Joseph Warren, author of the Suffolk Resolves, and serving as a common soldier because his officer's commission hadn't come through yet, was shot and killed. Unfortunately, again, for the British, the taking of the redoubt had broken up their ranks, and by the time they were organized enough to press on, the remaining militiamen had elected to withdraw from the peninsula altogether, which meant that the British won the battle, always and forever erroneously called the Battle of Bunker Hill. But the body count soon told a somber story. 200 regulars killed with another 800 wounded. Henry Clinton noted wryly in his diary that a few more such victories would have surely put an end to British dominion in America. After the battle, the two sides settled back into their respective positions. A few weeks later, July the 2nd to be exact, Washington arrived to take on overall command of the army, which now numbered about 16,000, though only about 14,000 were fit for duty. The British, meanwhile, now had at the moment about 6,000 in Boston, a number that would grow to 9,000 by early 1776. But although the colonial turnout was pretty good, it was also composed entirely of Washington's arch-enemy, the local militia company. These guys were just generally disrespectful of normal army life. They came and went as they pleased, and they elected their own officers, so good luck keeping anyone in line. The irony, of course, is that these guys pretty much embodied the kind of freedom and liberty the war was supposed to be about, and Washington had no time or patience for any of it. He started issuing all kinds of orders against things like drinking and gambling and swearing, and any officer or enlisted man who failed to live up to his standards was simply summarily dismissed. As he beat this army into shape, literally beat, lashings were an everyday occurrence, Washington also strengthened the fortifications around Boston, which were at that point, frankly, embarrassing. As Washington got to work up in New England, the Congress down in Philadelphia continued work on building a justification for their actions, though they sent out somewhat mixed messages, despite the fact that they were drafted by the same two men, John Dickinson and the newly arrived Thomas Jefferson. Passed at almost the same time, we have on the one hand the Olive Branch Petition, a last attempt at peacefully negotiating away the economic underpinnings of the conflict, and on the other, we have the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, which is hopefully pretty self-explanatory. In the former, Jefferson's draft was softened by Dickinson, who still clung to the dream of reconciliation, while in the latter, Dickinson actually made Jefferson's draft blunter and more direct, because he may have been worried he was about to lose all influence if he didn't do something to prove that his heart was still in this thing. And he did technically believe that the colonists were right to defend themselves, just not that independence was the aim. But whatever hope of negotiated reconciliation still lingered died, when King George refused to even receive the Olive Branch Petition, and Parliament officially declared the colonies in rebellion. Back up in Boston, by now both sides were well dug in, and both firmly under the command of their new respective leaders, General Washington for the Americans, and William Howe for the British, who took over from the now thoroughly discredited General Gage in late September 1775. Now, William Howe is a pretty interesting dude. He was one of three brothers, all of whom had distinguished military careers, and indeed his older brother is Admiral Richard Howe, who will serve as the Supreme Naval Commander during the war. So really, for the next couple of years, the British war effort is in the hands of the Howe brothers. And the Howe brothers were, wait for it, entirely sympathetic to the American colonies. They were pretty staunch Whigs who opposed most of the ministry's policies in America and really super opposed the Intolerable Acts. In fact, Admiral Richard Howe had initiated last-minute back-channel dealings with Benjamin Franklin to try to avert war. But when war came, neither could refuse the service they had been called to, and so when William Howe took over for Gage, his aim was to win the war. But as we will see, there will be more than a few missed opportunities along the way, which some have attributed to Howe's preference for comfortable inaction, some to his unwillingness to waste troops, especially after what he saw at Bunker Hill. But what I sometimes suspect is that there was a desire in Howe not just to win the war, but also the peace that would follow the inevitable British victory. And waging too brutal a war would unjustly punish the colonists for defending a cause that Howe himself was entirely sympathetic to. As the autumn of 1775 set in, everyone was still staring at each other and occasionally chatting with each other across the lines. But by now, Washington faced the great problem that would plague him for the entire war. All those militia enlistments that were due to expire on January the 1st. And none of those guys had even hinted that they planned to stick around, the general feeling being that we've done our bit, now it's time for somebody else to take over. So as he's trying to hold the siege together, Washington is also about to have to completely swap out his army, and of course lose whatever training may have sunk in with all those lashings. As the commander-in-chief stared down this problem, one of his new subordinates was staring down a problem of his own, one that would be just as critical to winning Boston as the problem of refilling the American ranks. In November 1775, Washington sent the, let's call him plump, Henry Knox, 25-year-old bookseller, but now self-taught artillery expert, up to Fort Ticonderoga to figure out how to move the guns to Boston, a problem made nearly unsolvable because of the fact that there were no roads linking the two. But on December the 5th, Knox set off into the snowy wilderness with 44 guns, both light and heavy, 14 mortars, 1 howitzer, and all the ammunition to run them, totaling some 60 tons of material. It has gone down in history as the noble train of artillery, and over the next 10 weeks, Knox's men used first barges and then oxen-pulled sleds to literally drag the guns south, finally arriving in the American camp on January the 27th. It was a bona fide miracle. In the meantime, Washington was busy reforming his army. Spirits were still pretty high at this point, and the militias had managed to recruit and/or retain 7,000 men, while the first batch of official Continental soldiers showed up, totaling some 9,000 men, which was good, though it fell well short of the target 20,000. Washington was utterly sick to death of the siege at this point, and soon proposed an audacious attack on the unsuspecting British. But his war council talked him down, and suggested instead tightening the noose by fortifying Dorchester Heights with the recently arrived guns, because, inexplicably, neither side yet controlled this all-important high ground. But trying to occupy the heights was not without its own risks. The job would have to be done silently and all in one night, or the Americans would be wide open for an attack by the British. Not only that, but the ground was too frozen to dig into, so how would they even defend themselves once they got there? After working through the logistics of the thing, Washington and his officers finally determined that yes, it was doable, and yes, they were going to go for it. On the night of March the 2nd, 1776, they let fly a short bombardment to give the British something to think about. The next night, both sides started shelling each other, and the night after that, March the 4th, the shelling went into overdrive, just as Washington hoped, because as this artillery skirmish was playing out, 1,200 workmen and 800 infantrymen hurried up the heights and got to work. Now, they had already constructed above-ground fortifications and worked furiously but silently through the night, successfully constructing 2 redoubts and mounting the biggest guns before dawn. According to the old legend, when Howe woke up the next morning, he was amazed and said, "My God, these fellows have done more in one night than I could make my army do in 3 months." It's doubtful that he actually said it, but the sentiment feels about right. With the American artillery looming over them, the British position in Boston became untenable. But in the end, this was all possibly more embarrassing and annoying to Howe than it was a devastating strategic blow, and many historians suspect that he had already decided to evacuate Boston. So what the fortification of Dorchester Heights really meant was that he could no longer leave on his own terms. Indeed, Howe now concluded that he couldn't leave without a fight, and he planned a full-scale assault of the American position on the heights, but a debilitating blizzard canceled the operation at the last minute, and Howe took the hint. On March 17th, all the British troops were out of Boston and loaded onto their transports, where they sailed away for Halifax. Washington led a triumphal procession into the city to wild jubilation in the streets. So all things considered, it had been a pretty great year for the American patriots. They had proven their resolve at Lexington and Concord, proven their courage at Bunker Hill, and now forced the British out of Boston completely. But of course, 1776 will not prove nearly so glorious, nor was 1775 so uniformly successful. So next week, we will backtrack a little and cover the debacle that was the invasion of Canada, and then head into the auspicious year of 1776, which will see the colonies boldly declare independence, and then get trounced repeatedly in the field, making some doubt whether they could back up their lofty rhetoric. Hello, and welcome to Revolutions. Episode 22, Independence. Okay, so last week saw the official outbreak of war after a decade of political and economic tension. And we ended with the cobbled-together American army under General Washington successfully pushing the British, led now by General Howe, out of Boston. There's a lot to get to today, so let's get right into it. Except, of course, before we can go forward, we have to go backwards, because while the British and Americans were stuck manning the siege lines of Boston during the fall and winter of 1775, the ill-fated attempt to capture Canada was launched, and then crashed, and then burned. Now, I have gotten more questions about the Canadians than almost any other subject. Specifically, why didn't they join the rebellion? The answer is pretty straightforward. Setting aside the smallish fishing and trading settlements in, say, Newfoundland, that were basically just British commercial outposts at this point, what we're really talking about here is Quebec. And the reason Quebec stayed out of it is twofold. First, the vast majority of the population was French Catholic. And if there are two great tastes that do not go great together, it's French Catholics and New England Puritans. Both distrusted the other for all kinds of obvious reasons, and on top of that, they had been periodically fighting wars against each other for the last 100 years or so, culminating with the recent French and Indian War. So right off the bat, it's a hard sell. The other reason is that after the British took over from the French in 1763, the ministry actually showed some common sense and did not try to outlaw Catholicism in North America. Then, in 1774, as I mentioned a few episodes back, Parliament passed the Quebec Act, which extended the boundaries of the territory, and was very likely an overt attempt by the ministry to get the Canadians to at least stay neutral in the coming conflict. So the answer to why didn't the Canadians join the rebellion is basically long-standing enmity between French Catholics and New England Puritans, plus the British offering a far better deal, Catholic toleration, etc., than the Continental Congress would ever be able to promise. All that said, though, when the Second Continental Congress first got together in May 1775, one of the first things they did was send feelers up to Quebec asking them to join in the fun, and promising not to invade. But, no doubt confirming every suspicion the French Canadians had, the Congress then promptly okayed a plan to invade Canada. Overall command of this northern theater was given to one of the delegates, Philip Schuyler, who was a pretty big deal in New York and will eventually marry his daughter to a brilliant young officer named Alexander Hamilton, but poor health is going to keep him out of it for the most part, so let's not worry about him. That leaves us with the men who actually ran the two-pronged invasion, Irish-born General Richard Montgomery, and now Colonel Benedict Arnold, who, after being passed over for the command by Congress, went behind their backs and convinced Washington to let him launch an independent expedition of his own. Montgomery proceeded north from Fort Ticonderoga in September 1775, on a methodical march that would take him up to Montreal and then down the St. Lawrence River to the capital, Quebec City. Arnold, meanwhile, set out from Massachusetts on a ship bound for Maine with about 1,000 men. The idea was to land and then quickly march the 180 miles north from the coast to Quebec City, except that Arnold was working from a terrible map, and that 180 miles turned out to be 350 miles of grueling wilderness. It was not until the middle of November, so we're talking about 2 months here, that Arnold and what was left of his company, because about a third had been forced back, were finally able to cross the last river for the final approach on the Canadian capital. They were in, as you can imagine, no shape to attack, so they fell back 20 miles and joined up with Montgomery and about 300 of his men. Now, though Montgomery had successfully taken all the various forts that had crossed his path, including Montreal, none of it had been easy, and the small army of now about 1,000 men camped southwest of Quebec City had no equipment or fortitude to sustain a prolonged siege. That meant they had to attack or go home. On top of that, Montgomery and Arnold faced the same problem Washington was facing down in Boston. Everyone's enlistments were going to expire December the 31st. So Montgomery and Arnold decided to go for it, launch a hopefully secret attack, and take the city before the garrison of just under 2,000 British knew what hit them. After an aborted false start on December 27th, the attack got going finally on December the 31st, so literally the last possible day, into a wicked blizzard, which stunk, yes, but it did help mask their approach. Now, just to give you a little layout here, Quebec City is built on both sides of a sharp cliff, dividing the city between Upper Town and Lower Town. The Upper Town was all but impossible to take, so the plan called for Arnold to lead 600 men against the north end of Lower Town, while Montgomery led 300 against the southern end. You seize Lower Town, you cut off the supply line to Upper Town, and force a surrender. But the British officers in charge of the city's defenses knew their stuff. So when the Americans came at them at dawn on New Year's Eve, they had fortified the exact spots Arnold and Montgomery planned to hit. Arnold managed to break through the first line of defense, but his men were stopped at the second line, where Arnold himself was badly wounded in the leg. Montgomery, meanwhile, was relying on an element of surprise that just did not materialize, and his men were mowed down. He himself was killed almost instantly. The whole plan fell apart. 50 or 60 Americans lay dead, and soon another 400 were captured. The badly injured Arnold managed to cobble together what men he had left and regroup, hoping that spring and fresh recruits would bring better tidings. It wouldn't, of course, and for all intents and purposes, the opportunity to take Canada was now past. Before we go on, though, I should mention that the death of Montgomery presents one of the great what-ifs of the war, because everyone recognized him as one of the most talented officers on either side, and it is tantalizing to think what he might have been able to accomplish had he not died in a blizzard trying to take Quebec in 1775. With war breaking out all over the continent, the great political question of the day now consumed the rebellious American colonies. Is all of this fighting simply about forcing the king and parliament to make concessions, or are we now fighting for independence? For the moment, this was still an open question, although certainly men like John and Sam Adams believed from the beginning that this was about independence, as too did King George III, who saw in America nothing but an enormous conspiracy to steal his colonies. But the vast middle ground of public opinion was still undecided. The process of moving that public opinion decisively towards independence started with some recent British provocations, including the intentional destruction of Falmouth, Massachusetts, now Portland, Maine, by gunships in October 1775, and then the destruction of Norfolk, Virginia by gunships on New Year's Day 1776, an attack which also saw the governor of Virginia issue a proclamation that any slaves who abandoned their masters and came over to the British side would be set free, which frankly scared the hell out of planters in Virginia because the governor was more or less inviting their worst nightmare, a slave uprising. So this hardened hearts all over Virginia to the possibility of reconciliation. And so yes, ironically, this attempt to free slaves led directly to the formation of a nation founded on freedom that then turned around and kept all the slaves in bondage. Because, like I say, slavery is just the vicious hypocrisy in the middle of all of this. It's unavoidable and plain as day. But the big turn came later in January 1776, the publication of one of the most famous pamphlets, well, ever, Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Now, since Tom Paine is going to hang around for a while, well, I think we'd better sketch him out. Because by a while, I mean that when we move on to the French Revolution, he's going to come along with us, wind up sitting as a delegate in the National Convention, and then, because Tom Paine can never stop being Tom Paine, sitting in a French prison. Thomas Paine was born in England in 1737, so he was just shy of 40 when he wrote Common Sense. He was also only a very recent immigrant to America. After a life of failure in business and government, he came to the attention of Benjamin Franklin because whatever else his failings were, it was clear that Paine was curious, intelligent, and above all passionate. With his life in shambles, he sold all his property to keep out of a debtor's prison and then separated from his wife. Paine elected to start over in America and was given a letter of introduction from Franklin to help him land a job when he got there. The job he landed was as editor of a small Pennsylvania magazine, and he quickly lent his support and his pen to radical politics, drafting Common Sense over the autumn of 1775, and then seeing it published in January 1776. Now, Common Sense was not the first nor even the best argument for independence, but it did two things better than any other attempt to galvanize public opinion. First, it pushed the debate well past the specific economic or constitutional issues at stake, and cast the struggle in much broader terms. Paine's object of scorn was not this or that tax, but the entire structure of the British monarchy, which was as absurd as it was corrupt. Second, it did so in blunt language that was easily accessible to the general public. This was no erudite treatise on political philosophy. This was a cannon blast fired at point-blank range. It electrified those who read it, and in just 3 months, something like 100,000 copies had been printed and sold. This is an impossibly huge number. So with the arrival of spring 1776, the British now evacuated from Boston, and Common Sense circulating, independent-minded delegates at the Second Continental Congress started pushing their agenda harder. John Adams recommended that the colonies should begin forming new governments, which meant independence in all but name. The remaining moderates, though, still led by Dickinson, attempted to get a bill passed that would officially claim that independence was not the goal, but the report was tabled and never taken back up. Then, instructions started filtering into the delegates from back home, freeing them to vote for independence, should it come to that. And it was definitely coming to that. The ball really started rolling downhill in May, because on May the 4th, Little Rhode Island stepped forward and unilaterally declared independence, which I just love because, as we will see when we get to the Constitution, Rhode Island will be the last to ratify. So first out, last in. That's Rhode Island. Then, on May the 10th, Congress formally instructed the colonies to start setting up new state governments. And on May the 15th, the Virginia House of Burgesses instructed their delegates to not just vote for independence, but to move for it. In the middle of this, Congress then learned that the British ministry had gone shopping in Europe for mercenaries, turning first to the Russians, and then when the Russians turned them down, to the Germans. John Adams believed that this news was probably the final nail in the coffin. What reconciliation could there be with a king who was prepared to use foreign mercenaries against his own people? So on June the 7th, Virginia delegate Richard Henry Lee formally moved, quote, that these United States are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. They are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved. John Adams immediately seconded. Now, one of the big practical questions was how this would affect relations with Europe. Because though the Americans had held their own in the first year of the war, everyone knew that foreign aid of some kind from someone was critical to winning the war. Money, soldiers, a navy. So many of the delegates wanted to wait until such an alliance was in place before declaring independence. But John Adams argued that it had to be the other way around. First declare independence to prove that we mean business, and then work out an alliance with France or Spain or whoever, not as rebellious colonies, but as a full-fledged nation. The debate on independence ebbed and flowed through June, as the Congress was forced always to deal with its daily minutiae. But in the meantime, a committee of 5 men was appointed to draft a proposed Declaration of Independence. Named to this committee were John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Guy No. 3, Guy No. 4, and of course the man who actually wound up drafting the thing, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was born in Virginia in 1743, so he's just 33 years old when he sits down to write the Declaration of Independence. His father had died when he was 14, so when Jefferson turned 21, he inherited 5,000 acres and about 40 slaves. When he was 16, he went off to the College of William and Mary, where he blazed through the entire curriculum and proved himself to be one of the brightest and most broadly curious minds in North America. He was voraciously interested in everything, although by trade he wound up a lawyer, entering the Virginia bar in 1767. He married Martha Wales Skelton in 1772, And when her father died the next year, Jefferson inherited another 11,000 acres plus 135 slaves, but also a crushing great load of debt, which got Jefferson started on his lifelong hobby of being monumentally, absurdly in debt. On the eve of the war, he joined the Virginia House of Burgesses and then served as a delegate to the Second Continental Congress, where he gained a reputation as something of a wallflower. This was mostly because Jefferson was not the fiery orator that John Adams and Patrick Henry were, but he was also possibly sulking at being stuck in Philadelphia and not back in Virginia helping draft the new state constitution. Little knowing that he was about to wind up smack dab at the crucible of American, and dare I say world, history. Since creating the new Virginia Constitution was actually what Jefferson wanted to be doing, he had with him all kinds of notes and letters pertaining to the debate, including copies of the famous Virginia Declaration of Rights, which were adopted in mid-June. So when he was called on to draft the Declaration of Independence, that's what Jefferson had to work from. Now, for those of you who are really interested in exploring all the details of this, I recommend Pauline Maier's American Scripture, which examines in pretty exquisite detail not just the role the Virginia Declaration of Rights played in Jefferson's draft, obviously a big one, but also the 90 or so other declarations of independence that were floating around out there, as the various county committees or town councils adopted resolutions defending their rights. Jefferson, working from notes and memory, had about 2 weeks to knock out a draft that would lay out the various accumulated grievances that justified independence. Jefferson's great accomplishment was writing this up quickly and eloquently. The point was never originality, and no one, certainly not Thomas Jefferson, thought what he was writing would basically become the centerpiece of American civic religion. With the draft completed, a debate on independence resumed on July the 1st. Now, almost everybody was for it at this point, though New York was paralyzed by a lack of instructions from home, and the Delaware delegation was evenly split and waiting for an absent delegate to show up and break the tie, which he did the next day. That left South Carolina and the John Dickinson-led Pennsylvania delegations as the two states still holding out. But with the Congress now absolutely ready to vote for independence, unanimity became important, and South Carolina finally got on board, and then in a magnanimous display, Dickinson and his allies abstained, allowing the remaining Pennsylvania delegates to let Pennsylvania stand with the rest. So on July the 2nd, 1776, the Second Continental Congress voted unanimously in favor of independence. Still left, though, was approving the Declaration. Over the next 2 days, while Jefferson sat in silent agony, the Congress went through his draft line by line, cutting a phrase here, rewording a phrase there. I mean, really, if you're a writer, you can understand just how painful this had to be, especially since Jefferson was famously thin-skinned and hypersensitive about criticism. But as it turns out, and again I'm getting this from Pauline Maier, the editing done by the Congress was excellent, especially given that this is being done by committee, which, oh my god, is a terrible way to edit a garage sale announcement, let alone the Declaration of Independence. Now, either through haste or passion, Jefferson had written stuff that either went too far or was just flat out not true. Like his original draft famously blamed the king for foisting the institution of slavery on unwilling colonists, which, let's just say that's a tough case to make. If you read American Scripture, you will also find an edited copy of the original draft, so you can see exactly what changes were made and why. The final draft is better, and on July the 4th, 1776, it was unanimously approved. If you want to hear it in all of its eventually tedious glory, I recorded the Declaration of Independence as a standalone supplemental. Try not to fall asleep. Meanwhile, back on the military front, Washington had led the Continental Army south to what he believed would be the key strategic point of the war, New York City. When the general got a copy of the Declaration of Independence, he assembled his army on July the 9th and had it read aloud, hoping it would give the men that extra burst of patriotism and purpose that would see them through the coming wave of British troops. If that was the plan, well, George Washington and his army are about to endure a rotten 6 months. Now, Washington was at least right in guessing British intentions, and the Howe brothers did indeed select New York City as their point of return, bringing with them just over 30,000 soldiers, including 8,000 Hessians, a catch-all label for mercenaries of German origin who would wind up particularly hated and feared as the war goes on. Washington and his officers supposed that Howe's plan was to take New York and then either launch himself back into New England or head up the Hudson to link up with an anticipated invasion force from Canada. Howe and his forces landed on Staten Island, a little southwest of New York City proper. But the key strategic point would be the northwest corner of Long Island, aka Brooklyn Heights, which overlooked New York City and had been fortified by the Americans. To take the city, Howe would have to first drive Washington's forces off the heights. Never one to rush into things, Howe sat around on Staten Island for a good 7 weeks before he finally made a move. On August the 22nd, he dispatched 15,000 troops to Long Island under Henry Clinton and Lord Charles Cornwallis, who will prove to be one of the most formidable of the British generals, even though he is known to history as the guy who surrendered at Yorktown. So the approach to Brooklyn Heights was screened by steep hills, through which there were 4 possible passes. The Americans were of course guarding these closely. Well, 3 of them anyway, because Jamaica Pass, the pass furthest from the British landing site on the far American left, was officially guarded by 5 men. I'm sure you can guess which pass Clinton decided to waltz through. Now, as the British are landing, Washington is doing nothing to reinforce his men on Long Island, because he's afraid that this is all a feint to draw him out of the city. Fortunately, for those of us who venerate Washington like a minor deity, his war record is definitely spotty, and this is one of those not-so-great moments, because it was no feint, this was the attack, and he was letting it unfold unopposed. On the evening of August 26th, the British and their Hessian partners set out on a night march. Diversionary attacks and shelling on the 3 other passes covered Henry Clinton's silent march through Jamaica Pass, and just like that, behind the American forward lines. Between the shelling and Clinton's men coming up from behind, the American left had collapsed by 9 a.m. The right held out bravely, but it too soon broke apart. By noon, the Americans had scrambled back to an inner line at Brooklyn Heights. Belatedly, Washington sent over reinforcements, but by now it was too late for them to do any good. A nasty nor'easter, sent, I suppose by God, kept the British at bay the whole next day, during the course of which Washington's War Council convinced him that defending the heights was now folly. So on the night of August the 29th, 2 regiments of Massachusetts militiamen, who also happened to be expert seamen, ran a convoy of boats and managed, with the help of some timely fog, probably also sent by God, to withdraw 9,500 men without the British suspecting a thing. Because if there was one thing Washington turned out to be the master of, it was the flawless retreat. And I'm not being snarky about that. George Washington could extract an army from hell before the devil knew he was gone. No doubt surprised by this flawless retreat, Howe declined to press the advantage. But inside New York City, Washington was dealing with an utterly demoralized army, now sick, under-provisioned, and deserting at will. He started preparing a new defense when he got instructions from Congress telling him that New York City was not a hill he had to die for. So the War Council immediately switched to planning an evacuation. 2 weeks later, Howe finally got moving and put in a landing east of the city, so the American army fled north up the west side of Manhattan Island to Harlem Heights, leaving behind crucial provisions and artillery. But after the Americans took the heights, an advanced British guard bungled into what became the Battle of Harlem Heights and were driven off, giving the Americans a much-needed morale boost. After that, everyone sat tight for a month to plan their next moves. Now, interestingly, just before the Battle of Harlem Heights, a 3-man delegation from the Second Continental Congress, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and a third guy, traveled up to New York and met with Howe on Staten Island to see about getting the British to recognize their recently declared independence. The resulting sit-down was scrupulously polite, but a total failure. Howe said, correctly, that he had no authority over such matters. So the delegation left after a few hours, and the war continued. In mid-October, Howe moved by boat up to a spot due east of Harlem that would allow him to hopefully trap the Americans on Manhattan Island. So Washington ran north again, this time off the island up to White Plains, where a Continental Supply Depot was located. The Americans quickly cobbled together entrenchments running east-west to hopefully block the British coming up from the south. Contact was finally made on October the 28th, with General Clinton again leading a column up towards the American left, with the Hessians approaching the American right. A sharp battle ensued that saw the Americans manage to halt the advance. But with the line standing still, the Hessian artillery then scattered the militiamen manning the American right, but reinforcements swooped in just in time. But the next push was too much. The Hessians charged in and broke the right flank, forcing the Americans into a fighting retreat, and though the militias on the right had obviously failed, it is worth pointing out that the Delaware militia on the left actually held firm enough to cover the retreat of the rest of the army. So, Delaware militia, good work. The Battle of White Plains was another British victory, but it also cost them another couple hundred wounded and killed, and Washington once again proved his ability to hold together a beaten army and retreat in good order. 2 days later, Howe was prepared to restart the fight, but heavy rains got in his way, and Washington was able to lead his men north and out of immediate reach. Howe decided that further pursuit was a waste of time, and he elected instead to turn around and head down to the mouth of the Hudson River, where 2 American forts allegedly guarded the entrance to this all-important waterway. So the big questions for Washington through early November hinged on the main fort, which had been named after him, Fort Washington, and which sat on the east bank of the Hudson River. Those questions were, can we hold it, and is it worth it? The answers turned out to be no and no. The British quickly proved that the forts probably weren't even worth it, when they sailed a few test ships up the Hudson to see if the artillery could stop them, which they couldn't. As to whether the fort could be defended, Washington elected to defer to the man he had left in charge of the garrison, Nathaniel Greene, one of Washington's favorite officers, who will become really important when the war moves south, but for now is in the early let's make a bunch of mistakes phase of his career. Greene decided the fort could be defended. Washington himself rode down to inspect the defenses on November the 14th, and he did not like what he saw one bit. But he was carried away by Greene's enthusiasm, and despite his misgivings, headed back north to his own army. Of course, letting Greene stay was a huge mistake. The day after Washington left, the British moved into position, and the day after that they attacked and completely enveloped the fort. The surrender of Fort Washington was the biggest blow in a string of recent blows. 2,800 Americans captured, along with all their guns and supplies. General Greene got away, and though this is not the last mistake he's going to make, he will redeem himself in the Southern campaigns, and emerge as one of the great heroes of the war. Back up north, Washington struggled to prevent the total collapse of the war effort right then and there. At this point, he had personally led about 2,000 men across the Hudson River, leaving another 5,500 on the east side. This force was under the command of a guy we're going to talk about next week, the irascible veteran of various European wars and recent immigrant to America, General Charles Lee, who could not believe that he was taking orders from some incompetent colonial hack. After picking up another 1,000 troops or so, Washington struggled south into New Jersey, and after the fall of Fort Washington, was soon being pursued by Lord Cornwallis and 4,000 British and Hessians. For the next few weeks, Cornwallis was almost literally one step behind the Americans, arriving, for example, in New York just as the American rear guard was pulling out. In the first week of December, Washington and his men were almost captured at New Brunswick, and then a few days later almost captured at Princeton. I mean, this was damn near the end of the whole project. But General Washington was a sneaky fox, and he managed to cross the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, and then round up every boat for 50 miles in either direction, leaving the pursuing British with no way to cross. After a week of hunting for a way across the Delaware, Howe gave it up. Winter was descending, and winter is no time for a civilized Englishman to be fighting a war. He assigned the Hessians to man the Delaware River frontier, and told the rest of his troops to settle into winter quarters, mostly in New York City and Newport, Rhode Island. He wrote home to the ministry that all was well, and one more good season of campaigning should finish off this rebellion. And really, given how the last 6 months had gone, this was not an unrealistic assessment. But next week, George Washington will salvage the dignity of the American cause and give it something to cheer about when he defeats a bunch of hungover Germans at Trenton the day after Christmas. Hello, and welcome to Revolutions. Episode 22 Supplemental, The Declaration of Independence. The unanimous Declaration of the 13 United States of America, in Congress, July 4th, 1776. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government, and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and, when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases to the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond the seas to be tried for pretended offenses, for abolishing the free system of English laws in the neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war on us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrections among us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our immigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce to the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm resilience on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. and welcome to Revolutions. Episode 23, Crossing the Delaware. So I want to start this week with a brief note about Thomas Paine's common sense, helpfully provided in the comments by listener T. Scott Johnson. It would appear that a recent book called The Republic in Print has pretty effectively debunked the myth that common sense reached anywhere near 100,000 printed copies, which I'm glad to hear because, as I said, 100,000 copies was an impossibly huge number, and it turns out that I was right about that. So, thank you T. Scott Johnson, and good luck with the PhD. Last week, we left General Washington and his boys at a low point, having spent their first campaign season being beaten, outmaneuvered, and run off. By early December 1776, the only thing Washington can point to as a success was that his army was still in the field at all. But in a few weeks, even that small consolation might evaporate. Washington had escaped across the Delaware River with 3,000 men, half of whom had enlistments that were due to expire December the 31st. And that was on top of the 2,000 men who had already gone home when their enlistments ran out November 30. With nothing going for the American army at all, what was to stop it from simply melting away? Washington had managed to escape the clutches of General Howe, but could he escape the clutches of crushingly low morale? The answer turned out to be yes. Yes, he could. As you will recall, when General Howe opted to put his men into winter quarters, he left the Hessians to guard the frontier of the Delaware River, which marked the border between New Jersey to the east and Pennsylvania to the west. The Hessians manned a string of garrisons up and down the river, including the city of Trenton, which was right smack dab in the middle of that border. I actually managed to put a map up this week and managed to do one for the New York campaigns from last week that I couldn't get to. These Hessian garrisons provided a desperate Washington with one last chance to steal a victory before the year was up and his entire army went home. Now, incredibly, as Washington got to planning his operation, he received no reinforcements from the army he had left back up in New York. You remember them? The 5,500 men commanded by General Charles Lee? Despite Washington's repeated pleas to send troops, Lee just didn't do it. Mostly because Lee was busy waiting for the Congress to come to its senses, ditch Washington, and put him in charge of the Continental Army. And though Lee's belligerent ego was mostly what was at work here, on paper, he kind of had a point. Charles Lee was born in England in February 1732, so just a few weeks before Washington himself. The son of a major, he entered the regular army as a junior officer at the age of 15 and never looked back. He served throughout the French and Indian War, taking an American Indian wife in the process. Then he returned to Europe, served in Portugal, and then when his regiment was disbanded after peace with France, he went off to serve as a mercenary in Poland. Returning to Britain, he found himself so sympathetic to the American cause that he emigrated to Virginia in 1773, and when war broke out, he immediately volunteered for service. Now, given his record, he had little doubt Congress would appoint him commander-in-chief. But of course, there is also the matter of Charles Lee's personality. He was ill-tempered, foul-mouthed, slovenly, and followed everywhere by a loyal pack of dogs who were really his only friends. But probably the thing that really sunk him was that he demanded pay that George Washington announced would be beneath his own dignity to accept. So Lee wound up instead being given command of the Southern Department, and in mid-1776 he received credit for helping ward off an attack on Charleston, although that warding off was only accomplished after Lee's own expert advice was ignored. After Lee was transferred back up to New York, Washington did everything he could to placate Lee's ego because Washington was himself always entranced by the European way of war, a way that Lee knew better than anyone. It was indeed likely an overdose of respect that led Washington to merely encourage, rather than explicitly order, Lee to march from New York down to Pennsylvania. But Lee did not reciprocate this respect at all, and wasn't going to lift a finger to help Washington, because Lee was busy telling everyone who would listen, including the Congress in a steady stream of letters, that Washington was in way over his head and basically losing the war. As Washington's encouragement became less and less veiled, Lee slowly, ever so slowly got moving. But then comes the hilarious bit. On the road, Commander-in-Chief in his own mind, Lee, decided to spend the night in a tavern well removed from the rest of his army. The next morning, a mounted British patrol surrounded the house and captured Lee, who happened to be stark naked at the time. Whoops. Lee would spend the next 6 months in British custody before being exchanged for a captured British general. Given his conduct at Monmouth Courthouse, it probably would have been better for the Americans to exchange the captured British general for a sack of potatoes. So without further reinforcements, Washington was forced to draw up a plan to attack Trenton with what men he had on hand, and oh, what a plan it was. Because as much as Washington was the master of the flawless retreat, he was also the master of the insanely complicated battle plan. And he was always coming up with these schemes that involved 27 different moving parts that needed to work in perfect synchronization, and his plan for Trenton was classic Washington. It was laid out in 3 phases. First, 700 men would silently cross the Delaware River and seize a key bridge south of Trenton. Then, another 1,500 militiamen would cross even further south and launch a diversionary attack on the garrison at Bordentown. Then, Washington and his main force of 2,400 men would cross the Delaware themselves at midnight, divide into 2 columns, and take separate roads the 9 miles to Trenton. Then, they would all simultaneously be in position to strike the city no later than 5 a.m. So what we've got here is 4 different columns that will be moving in different directions at different times in the middle of the night in the dead of winter, all without tipping off the Hessians. And oh, by the way, if this doesn't work, that's the end of the war. Needless to say, this did not all unfold the way Washington planned, and it's frankly a wonder it all turned out as well as it did. The first 2 phases of the operation, for example, failed immediately, as neither the advanced unit nor the diversionary force had been able to cross at their assigned locations due to the icy conditions of the Delaware River. Facts Washington did not learn until well after the battle was over. Then, those same icy conditions destroyed his own timetable, and though everyone worked as fast and as well as they could, Washington's army wasn't even ready to start marching until 4 a.m., and according to the plan, they were already supposed to be at Trenton by now. But Washington pressed on. What else could he do? He divided his 2,400 men into the 2 columns, one that would approach Trenton from the north, and one that would come up and around from the south. Amazingly, both these columns hit their marks at almost the same time, just about 8 a.m. As Washington led the final approach, though, he ran into a small independent company of about 50 Americans who knew nothing about the planned attack and were returning from a little raid on Trenton of their own, a raid that had seen them exchange gunfire with Hessian sentries. Washington was mortified and thought his entire operation was now exposed, but it's possible that this raid actually put the Hessians' mind at ease. You see, the Hessian colonel in charge of Trenton had been tipped off a few days earlier to watch out for a possible attack, and he had kept his men on high alert and running frequent patrols. When this little raiding party came and went, they thought the quote-unquote attack had now come and gone, and relaxed. Because it went without saying that in this crappy weather, nothing more could be expected from the Americans. And that brings us to the myth of the drunk and/or hungover Hessians. Unfortunately, for those of us who like a good story, the myth is just that, a myth. An eyewitness's report that the Hessians, though caught off guard because they were really not expecting a major attack given the rotten weather, they were stone sober before, during, and after the battle. As Washington led his column to the north side of Trenton, they skirmished with an outpost about a mile outside the city, forcing the Hessian guards into a fighting retreat that alerted the rest of the garrison in Trenton that something much bigger was on the way. But the Americans were able to place their artillery in time, one battery of which was commanded by a young artillery captain named Alexander Hamilton. As the Hessians tried to form up for battle, they were blasted into a chaotic mess. The Hessian colonel rushed around reforming his men for a counterattack, but wound up mortally wounded for his trouble. By now, the Hessians were squeezed between the advancing enemy on both sides, and within an hour, the Battle of Trenton was over. 22 Hessians lay dead, another 84 were wounded, and almost 1,000 captured, along with a bounty of muskets, bayonets, cannons, and provisions. The Americans suffered just 2 combat deaths and a few light wounds. It was exactly the kind of unambiguous, absolutely clear-cut victory that Washington and the Americans needed. The whole thing had been an enormous gamble, and had it failed, who knows whether the American rebellion would have gone down as little more than a historical footnote. Now, Washington's original plan was as ambitious as it was complicated, and he hoped to use the momentum from Trenton to immediately push on to Princeton. But the night's delays, coupled with exhaustion, coupled with the news that the other advanced units never had crossed the river, led Washington to call it good right there, and he led his men and prisoners back across the Delaware, away from easy British retaliation. The next day, though, Washington and his war council learned that the militiamen that were supposed to have been running the diversion down south and now operating independently had elected to cross the Delaware. With this force already on the other side, Washington decided to follow them back into New Jersey. So on December the 29th, Washington sent his men back across the river to reoccupy Trenton, which had the added benefit of making it just a little bit harder for those men who planned to ditch out on January the 1st to do so. When that fateful day did arrive, Washington gave impassioned addresses and offered bounties for just 6 more weeks' service. And of the roughly 5,000 he now had on hand, he was able to hold 3,000, at least for the time being. Joined by the militiamen who had crossed further south, Washington now had 5,000 or 6,000 men under his immediate command. Meanwhile, General Howe was not going to take the attack on Trenton lying down. Well, maybe he would, but his army sure wouldn't, and he dispatched 8,000 men under Lord Cornwallis to stamp out this burgeoning American resilience. Cornwallis marched through Princeton, dropped off a garrison, and then headed down to Trenton with 5,500 men. He was harassed the entire way by American forward units, whose sole job was to make him and his men hate their rotten luck for being stuck on this assignment. When Cornwallis got to Trenton, he found the Americans drawn up on a ridge south of town, with a creek between them and the approaching British. Cornwallis tried 3 times to cross the creek's bridge, but when each attempt failed, he decided to halt for the day and resume the attack in the morning, because from where he was sitting, Washington and his men were basically trapped up on that ridge. But local knowledge can be a powerful weapon, and during the night, leaving a few men behind to tend the line of fires and shoot random cannon shots, Washington led his army down back roads that weren't on any map. When dawn broke on January the 2nd, Cornwallis found the ridge empty, and the British garrison left at Princeton found itself under attack. The garrison was already on their way to join Cornwallis for the final assault on the ridge when they were hit by the army that was supposed to be trapped up on that ridge. In the initial fighting, the Americans were driven back and started to run for it, but Washington himself soon appeared on horseback, re-rallied the fleeing men, and pointed them back in the right direction. In the midst of all this, there was a moment when Washington was riding around between the 2 lines shouting encouragements to his men, when both sides started firing at once. Absolutely inexplicably, when the smoke cleared, Washington was still just riding around. Not dead, not even hit. Following this miracle, the bulk of the British forces were able to push through and run south for Trenton, while the rest were pushed back and captured in Princeton. With yet another victory in hand, and Cornwallis bearing down on him, Washington decided that it really was time to call it quits for the year, and he led his men into winter quarters in Morristown, New Jersey. Morristown was about 25 miles west of New York City, and well situated to stymie the British if they got it in their heads to move on Philadelphia or move up the Hudson River. Now, as we will see, winter was a dreadful time to be a soldier in the Continental Army. We're talking no clothes, no food, only super rudimentary shelter, there was disease, it was just the pits. But we'll talk more about it when we get to the famously hard winter next year at Valley Forge, and then a bit more when we talk about the less famously but even harder winter back in Morristown the year after that. These conditions made retaining soldiers so difficult that the fact that anyone stayed at all is positively miraculous. Washington's whole army was down to just 3,000 men by March, with expiring terms, desertion, and smallpox taking their heavy toll. As spring came, recruiters for the Continental Army did their best, and the total was back up to 9,000. But these recruiters were stymied by Washington's old nemesis, the colonial militias, who offered higher bounties, better pay, and better terms of service. Begging, pleading, and demanding that local leaders stop poaching able-bodied men would be a constant refrain from Washington all through the war. But, at least for the moment, his other bouts of begging, pleading, and demanding for guns and supplies got a little boost when American agents in France were able to set up back-channel supply lines from the French government run through a front company in Paris. The French were obviously interested in seeing the colonials take it to their British enemies, but throwing in with the Americans completely was still out of the question. So at this point, we're going to separate the two great threads that defined the war in 1777. Today, we're going to stick with General Washington, as he fails to keep the British out of Philadelphia, and then fails to knock them out after they seize the capital. That will take us all the way to the end of the year. But of course, as this is unfolding in Pennsylvania, the turning point of the war is unfolding in upstate New York. And we will talk about that next week, because otherwise it'll just be too much hopping around, as everything is happening simultaneously in September and October 1777. So sticking with Washington, the campaign season of 1777 did not get going until mid-June, when General Howe decided it was high time he set out on that one more year of good campaigning to finish off the rebellion. On June 17th, Howe moved a large force off Staten Island and flashed them around New Jersey, hoping to lure Washington into a decisive battle, but Washington did not take the bait. A week later, Howe maneuvered around again, trying to draw out the Americans, but Washington managed to squeeze his men out of a trap in the nick of time. These ploys having failed, Howe elected to abandon New Jersey, and then pull off the mainland completely. Stunts like this were the great reason why the Americans were doomed without foreign assistance. Because without an enemy navy to stop him, Howe could do things like put 18,000 men on transport ships, set out onto the high seas, and then put them back in wherever he wanted, which is exactly what he did in the summer of 1777. I mean, you could guess where his army was going to suddenly reappear, but there was no way of knowing for sure. And it understandably became Washington's great obsession over the summer. The available options, though, were basically threefold. Go after Philadelphia from some angle or another, head north to link up with the Burgoyne expedition coming down from Canada, that's what we're going to talk about next week, or transfer the whole focus of the war and head down to like Charleston, South Carolina. Now, from everyone's point of view, that is, the British ministry, the American War Council, the unanimous judgment of history, what Howe needed to do was go link up with Burgoyne. But for a variety of reasons we'll talk about next week, that did not happen. And from at least April forward, Howe had his eye on taking the rebel capital in Philadelphia. Once he put out to sea, the only question in his own mind was where exactly and when exactly he would land to make that attempt. The endlessly and helplessly frustrating days of speculation and inactivity finally ended for Washington at the end of August, when Howe put into Chesapeake Bay about 50 miles southwest of Philadelphia. While Howe let his men recuperate, the month at sea had been pretty awful, Washington got his army marching south, picking up militia companies along the way until he commanded nearly 20,000 men. On the way to the confrontation with the British, the American army entered and then marched as smartly as they could through the streets of Philadelphia. Washington tried to put on as good a show as he could, but even a casual observer could tell that these boys did not step as lively nor look as sharp as a professional army ought to step and look. Meanwhile, Howe was now on his way north with 15,000 men, harassed, as was now the custom, by small detachments of American forces. Washington moved west out of Philadelphia, and on September the 10th, he decided to draw up a line of about 14,000 Continentals and militiamen at Brandywine Creek. There were only a few places the British Army could ford the river, and the Americans worked to cover those spots and make the main road into Philadelphia impregnable. Unfortunately, as had been the case at Long Island, the Americans left open a pair of fords on the very far right of their line, possibly because they just did not know they were there. Howe found out about these open fords, so this time it was the British rather than the Americans who enjoyed that all-powerful weapon, local knowledge. At 4 a.m. on September the 11th, Howe sent forward a detachment of 5,000 men under one of the Hessian commanders to feign a frontal attack, while he and Cornwallis led the rest of the army on a wide flanking maneuver across those unguarded fords. Now, one of the questions looming over the Battle of Brandywine is that it appears Washington heard that something was up on his far right as early as 9:30 a.m., but he did not act, and no one really knows why. But it was possibly just because he didn't believe the reports. But by 2 in the afternoon, the bulk of the British forces were across the creek, and threatening the utterly exposed American right flank. Quickly, the American forces reformed a line to stop them, and they were given a little breathing room because Howe and Cornwallis took their sweet time forming up for the attack. By 4 o'clock, though, that attack came, and it quickly became apparent that the scrambling Americans had left a hole in their hastily reformed lines. The British poured through that hole, and though American reinforcements showed up and bought everyone some time, the fighting descended into brutal, ugly chaos, and the Americans broke and ran. Not in any kind of classic Washington-led order. This was panicked flight. Meanwhile, back where Washington had thought the battle was going to take place, the Hessian commander had waited for the sound of Howe's attack to press right up the middle. They fought their way across the creek and engaged in fierce close-quarters combat. But the fighting had started so late in the day that darkness soon forced both sides to pull back. Washington wasted no time catching his breath. He and his men were beaten and beaten bad, and they had to get the hell out of there and regroup. So, while the British did take a breather, the Americans spent the night in full retreat. The Battle of Brandywine was yet another clear-cut victory for Howe over Washington, though somehow the American army still stood between the British and Philadelphia. A week and a half later, though, Howe maneuvered around and tricked the battered Americans into following him a ways up the Schuylkill River before doubling back and crossing at a lower ford. That left the way to Philadelphia wide open. On September 18th, the delegates of the Second Continental Congress, learning that they were exposed, booked it eventually to York, Pennsylvania, where they would remain in exile for the next year. But when the British marched into Philadelphia on the 26th, looking every bit the professional army the Continentals had just shown themselves not to be, it wasn't the decisive blow Howe had hoped it would be. I mean, hello, I just took your capital. That means it's time to surrender. Hello? Do you guys even know how to play this game? But the Americans did not know how to play that game, and Washington and his men retreated 25 miles outside of the city to plan their next move. Once in Philadelphia, Howe had to scatter his forces so they wouldn't trip over each other trying to sleep and eat. But knowing that the American army was still out in the neighborhood, he concentrated 9,000 men at Germantown, about 5 miles north of the city. Washington and his officers decided that taking the forces at Germantown was risky, but too juicy to pass up because, for the moment, the Americans would actually outnumber the British there. And if it went totally right, a victory at Germantown, along with the utterly astounding American victory up at Saratoga, might just be enough to win the war. I mean, seriously. Despite everything, the Americans were in a really good position to win the Revolutionary War right there in the fall of 1777. As with Trenton, Washington's battle plan for Germantown was a perfect work of art, just as long as it didn't try to, leave the tent. It involved 4 columns setting out on night marches so that they could simultaneously attack Germantown from 4 different directions at dawn, which is all well and good, except that it's night, the terrain is difficult, and some of the columns have much farther to march than others. Oh, also, a heavy fog is about to set in. It would be hard enough to pull off Washington's plan for Germantown with modern communications. Without them, well, good luck, everybody. They did at least think to stick a piece of white paper in everyone's hat so that they could tell their friend from their enemy when they all got to the other side. A force marched through the night of October the 3rd and 4th, put the various columns close to Germantown without yet being detected. But only one of the flanking columns reached its intended position when dawn came. Finally, around 5 a.m., the American column that was aiming right at the heart of town came rolling in and kicked off the battle by firing on British guards, who sounded the alarm. Now, at this point, General Howe actually came riding out personally to convince these guards to hold firm, since they were only facing a few obnoxious raiders. When the American cannons started going off, though, Howe pulled back and his men quickly followed him. This was no party of raiders. This was a full-scale attack. But then the Americans started making mistakes. Instead of driving forward, they got bogged down at a stone house on the edge of town. Fortified by the British, Washington's options were either bypass it or try to take it. He almost elected to bypass it, but Henry Knox convinced him that the oldest war manuals in the world said never leave a strong point in your rear, and promised that his artillery boys could take it. But after an hour of banging cannonballs off the side of the house, it turned out that Knox's artillery boys could not in fact take it, and they were just wasting time, ammunition, and more than a few men. Meanwhile, the other American columns started pouring into town from their different directions, but the heavy fog made everything super confusing. One unit fell back because they thought they were exposed when they really weren't. Another detachment coming in from the flank took a wrong turn and wound up banging into those retreating guys, and they all started firing at each other. Meanwhile, the last column to arrive, led by Nathaniel Greene, pushed into the mix, and his advanced companies managed to actually capture a bunch of prisoners. But then those advanced units were themselves surrounded. Believing the rest of the army in retreat, Greene too withdrew. Realizing that this had all gone awry, Washington ordered a full retreat, and his army was chased for nearly 10 miles before Greene's forces were able to buy the rest time to get away completely. The Battle of Germantown was yet another defeat for the Americans, but oddly enough, it actually helped Benjamin Franklin make the all-important case he was currently making to the French. Because despite it all ending in failure, European observers in America were impressed by the sophistication of the plan, the bravery of the troops, and as always, the disciplined retreat. It had all gone haywire in the fog, but you really can't blame them for that, and one or two breaks and Germantown would have been a smashing American success. So it was clear by the end of 1777 that the Continental Army had shaped up to be a real army, not just some pretend mob of hooligans. But this was little comfort for Washington himself as he and his army settled into their famously hard winter at Valley Forge, because he was forced to dwell on the defeats at Brandywine and Germantown and question his own ability to win the war. And he was not the only one asking those questions. Next week, though, we are going to go back in time to the spring of 1777 and run through the Saratoga campaigns up in the north, which started with British General John Burgoyne setting out on what he thought was some kind of luxurious triumphal parade, and ended with him handing over his sword. Hello, and welcome to Revolutions. Episode 24, Saratoga. So last week, we dropped off General Washington at Valley Forge, where he would try to hold his army together over the rough winter of 1777-1778. Meanwhile, we will be going back in time to cover the Saratoga campaign of 1777 that did so much to turn the course of the war, at least in hindsight. Because though Saratoga is the correct response if you're like on Jeopardy and the answer is the turning point of the American Revolution, there are so many moving parts at work here that to completely isolate one part and say that's the one is a gross oversimplification. And that doesn't even take into account the fact that after Saratoga, the war could have spun off in a wildly different direction than it did. But it didn't. So thanks in part to the American victory at Saratoga, the French got into the war, and their involvement turned out to be critical to the final victory at Yorktown. Therefore, Saratoga is the turning point of the American Revolution. I'll take famous titles for 200, please, Alex. But before we even get into the Saratoga campaign, we need to hop back even further to the American retreat from Canada. When last we left the Northern Department, the Americans had failed to take Quebec on New Year's Eve 1775. Benedict Arnold found himself in charge of the bedraggled remnants of the Continental and militia forces. Arnold laid a siege to Quebec City through the winter, but come the spring of 1776, it was pointless to stick around. The British sent in massive reinforcements, and the Americans had to pull back. Arnold, by this point, had been promoted to brigadier general and made military governor of Montreal. And though he craved even more responsibility, he remained a few rungs down on the chain of command. Philip Schuyler, I got his name right this time, remained in overall command of the Northern Department, and then in June 1776, General Horatio Gates was given command over the loosely defined Canadian Department. So, let's talk about Horatio Gates. Horatio Gates was born in England in 1728. As a young man, he bought an officer's commission and served on the continent before following his military mentor to Canada on the eve of the French and Indian War. He was, along with George Washington and Charles Lee and Thomas Gage, present on Braddock's disastrous opening march, and then he served in North America continuously for the rest of the war, though not in any important capacity. After the war, he didn't have the money to buy the higher rank that would allow him to remain in the rapidly demobilizing British Regular Army, and after a few years of doing this and that, he emigrated to Virginia in 1772, where he made contact with his old comrade George Washington. When the Revolutionary War broke out, he joined immediately, and with the enthusiastic recommendation of Washington, was appointed the first adjutant general, basically the chief administrative officer of the Continental Army. Because though Gates was not really a great field officer, he was a hell of an organizer, and deserves a lot of credit for helping build the new Continental Army from scratch. He yearned for that field command, though, and as I said, in June 1776, the Congress gave way and put him in command of the Canadian Department, which was supposed to be nested in the larger Northern Department, but Gates and his supposed boss, General Schuyler, hated each other. Schuyler was aristocratic and stiff, while Gates was an easygoing friend of the common soldier. Schuyler claimed command over Gates, and Gates claimed autonomy from Schuyler. Eventually, Congress had to step in to resolve this petty bickering by giving Gates a free hand from Fort Ticonderoga north. This victory in office politics, though, netted Gates very little, because at that same moment, the Americans were abandoning everything north of Fort Ticonderoga. So as I said, the British were massively reinforced in the spring of 1776, and the totally inadequate American forces pulled back to Montreal and then out of Montreal. By June, that is when Gates showed up, the Americans had retreated to their two main bases on the south end of Lake Champlain, Fort Ticonderoga, of course, but also another one further north called Fort Crown Point. What Gates walked into was a report that some 9,000 British were massing at the north end of Lake Champlain under the British governor of Quebec, Guy Carleton. The long-anticipated British invasion from Canada appeared to be on the way. But Carleton quickly discovered that the retreating Americans had commandeered what ships on Lake Champlain they could and then burned the rest. Since there was no land route south to speak of, the British had to spend the summer of 1776 building a navy. Having bought themselves some time, the Americans set to work building a little navy of their own to hopefully further slow the British advance. The outnumbered and outclassed American army might not be able to stop the British invasion, but winter sure could, if we can tie them up that long. Now, the newly arrived Horatio Gates, by his own admission, had absolutely no clue when it came to Navy stuff, so he turned over the whole building operation to Benedict Arnold, because among the things Arnold had been uniformly successful at in his younger days was being a merchant sailor. By September, Arnold had managed to build up a little fleet of 15 ships run by about 500 men, which was pretty good, until you learn that up north the British have put together a fleet of 25 ships, and among that 25 there were two heavily loaded ones that alone carried more firepower than Arnold's entire fleet. So when the British launched in early October, Arnold's mission was merely to delay the British. He had no chance of stopping them. But Arnold was a crafty soldier, and he selected a nice little spot between Valcourt Island and the main shoreline of Lake Champlain to make his stand, and negate as much as possible the superior British numbers and firepower. On October the 11th, Arnold managed to lure the British into this narrow strait, and from noon till sunset the two sides blasted away at each other. The Americans inflicted some not inconsequential damage to the British, but the outcome of the Battle of Valcour Island, one of the very few naval battles of the war, was never much in doubt, especially once one of those heavy ships came lumbering into the fray in the late afternoon. When the sun finally set, Arnold did not hesitate to run for it. The path of his retreat was soon littered with ships too heavily damaged to continue. 2 days later, a favorable wind helped the British catch up with what was left of the American fleet, and Arnold raced for a shallow bay, where the heavier British ships couldn't follow. He ran his ships aground, burned them, and then continued overland with his remaining 200 men for Fort Crown Point. When he got there, Arnold discovered that a few of the ships that had gone missing in the retreat had made their way to Crown Point, which was great. He also discovered that there was no earthly way they could defend Crown Point, which was not so great. So Arnold burned the fort and led everyone south to Ticonderoga. Luckily for the Americans, though, when the British landed at the smoldering remains of Fort Crown Point, early winter snows had already fallen. There was no way to continue south given the terrain and the weather, so Carleton was forced to call it good for the year. A Hessian officer noted in his diary that had the expedition set out just 4 weeks earlier, they would have steamrolled all the way down the Hudson River and ended the war. Back in London, news that the invasion had been halted was met with incredulous disdain. I mean, why the hell had it taken Carleton all year just to get to Crown Point? He hasn't even taken Ticonderoga yet. It seems like we might need someone in there with a bit more verve. Which brings us to the second of the original triumvirate of reputation that had been sent by the British ministry to take over the war in 1775. John Burgoyne. John Burgoyne was born in England in 1722. At the age of 15, he purchased a commission in a showpiece cavalry regiment and soon earned himself a reputation for athleticism, good-natured grace, and fancy living, and he was soon dubbed Gentleman Johnny. He served during the War of Austrian Succession, but after that war ended, his career stalled, and he wound up eloping with the daughter of a prominent, and now furious, English lord. The couple went to live in France and Italy until they managed to patch things up with Daddy on the eve of war with France. When that war broke out, Burgoyne wound up a lieutenant colonel serving on the continent, and eventually he rose to the rank of brigadier general in Portugal, where he commanded, among others, the irascible future American general Charles Lee. Burgoyne was forward-thinking when it came to strategy and tactics, and popular enough with his men that after the war he turned to politics, and served as an actively engaged MP, leading the charge, for example, against the hopelessly corrupt East India Company. On the eve of war in America, John Burgoyne was easily one of the most popular soldiers in Britain, and it came as no surprise that he was selected to head over with William Howe and Henry Clinton to put the colonials back in their place. But the early days of the war had left Burgoyne dissatisfied with his role as Howe and Clinton's third wheel. So, with the siege of Boston still slogging along, he headed back to London to beg for a better opportunity, and was given command of those massive reinforcements that arrived in Quebec in the spring of 1776. He then served as one of the lead officers under Carleton in the run-down Lake Champlain that we just covered. Believing that Carleton had botched things by being too timid, Burgoyne again returned to London over the winter and talked the ministry into letting him run the invasion when it restarted in the spring of 1777. He promised to push all the way down the Hudson River. With General Howe occupying New York, the Patriot-heavy New England colonies would then be cut off from the middle and southern colonies. Thus divided, there would be no further hope of unified colonial resistance, and the war would practically win itself after that. Meanwhile, back in America, Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold both headed south over that same winter to help Washington try to stave off defeat. Arnold wound up taking a command in Rhode Island, but Gates was actually on hand for the Battle of Trenton, though it was there that he first flashed his true colors. Because on the night of the attack, he claimed he was too sick to fight, and then he ran down to Baltimore, where the Second Continental Congress was temporarily sitting, to lobby for Washington's job. The success of Trenton, of course, stalled any further moves on that front, so Gates returned to the north, served as the number 2 officer still stuck under Schuyler. Arnold, meanwhile, started down his road to treason when he was passed over for promotion in February, not for anything he had done, but simply because the Congress had to play politics with spreading commands around, and Connecticut already had its allotment of senior generals. There's no reason to delve too deeply to the dizzying career drama of Benedict Arnold, but suffice it to say he tried to resign, was talked out of it, and returned to service, still bitter over the insult. In May 1777, General John Burgoyne headed to Canada to drive what he believed would be the final stake through the heart of the American Rebellion, utterly convinced that by the end of the year he would be the hero of the war. He laid out a two-pronged invasion. He would lead the main army of about 8,000 south down Lake Champlain, while a diversionary army of about 2,000 would sweep in from the west by way of Lake Ontario. The two forces, both composed of a mix of British regulars and Hessian mercenaries, Loyalist Canadians, and Allied Indians, would link up at Albany for the final drive down the Hudson, where they would link up with Howe, who would no doubt already be on his way north by then. Of course, we know, thanks to last week's episode, that Howe isn't coming, but we'll let Burgoyne find that out in his own good time. As he put his expedition together, Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne paid close attention to the details, and he brought along crates of fancy dining sets, luxurious foods and wine, snappy uniform, because, what's the fun in marching off to eternal glory wearing rags and eating hardtack? Senior officers even brought along wives, girlfriends, and children. That there weren't really enough carts or pack animals to haul everything didn't seem to bother anyone. Sure, they might move a little slower, but that was okay. Upstate New York is beautiful this time of year. On June the 17th, Gentleman Johnny's party train set out from the last British fort north of Lake Champlain. It took all of 3 days for Burgoyne to make his first major mistake. He issued an open letter to the effect that if the rebels didn't give up, that he would be forced to unleash his Indian allies to do their very worst. This was supposed to scare the local citizens into compliance, but of course it had the opposite effect. Remember, this is the summer of 1777. Basically, nothing has gone right for the Americans, and morale was pretty low. All Burgoyne's ill-advised threat did was simply remind everyone in upstate New York why they had to keep fighting. This mistake was compounded a month later when an advance guard of Indians killed a few local settlers, including, most sensationally, a woman named Jane McCrae. The truth of what happened out there was murky then and is murky now, but what's important is that the killing of Jane McCrae was blown up by Patriot propaganda into a vicious act of barbarism that put lie to the notion that the British were somehow the more civilized army conducting a more civilized war. But that was still in the future. For the time being, all was well. Burgoyne's army was soon at the former site of Fort Crown Point, just north of Ticonderoga. The 2,000 or so Americans garrisoning Ticonderoga started preparing for a fight, but on July the 5th, the British cut their way up an unoccupied hill that commanded the fort. Any defense was now doomed to failure, so the 2,000 Americans ran southeast as fast as they could, and the British followed. Over the next couple of days, the British pursued the fleeing American soldiers, with the advanced British units catching up with the American rearguard on at least 3 separate occasions. But though these running battles took their toll, the Americans were ultimately able to move way faster than Gentleman Johnny's party train, which left Burgoyne with a choice to make. And boy howdy, did he make the wrong one. Now on the east side of the Hudson River, Burgoyne had to decide how he was going to get to Albany, which was on the west side of the Hudson. He could either circle back to Ticonderoga, transfer his army over to Lake George and take an easy shot down the Hudson, or he could continue to move forward, plunge into the wilderness, and just hope for the best. Burgoyne, inexplicably, chose the latter. He later said it was because his men would have reacted badly to a retreat, which is frankly kind of a weird and not a very good excuse. And some historians have pointed out that the easy shot down the Hudson he forsook would have been harder to pull off than Burgoyne's later critics made it seem. Whatever the reason, though, Burgoyne's column plunged into the wilderness, even though they had neither the supplies nor the equipment necessary to efficiently hack their way through the dense forest. By now, General Schuyler, for once actually doing something, came up to take command of Fort Edward, which was south of Burgoyne on the east side of the Hudson River, and Burgoyne's likely destination. Schuyler ordered his forces to make life excruciating for the slow-moving British procession. The Americans burned every bridge and chopped down every tree in Burgoyne's way, bridges that had to be rebuilt and trees that had to be removed one by one. This is about the time that everyone kind of wanted to get off of Gentleman Johnny's party train, but there was nowhere to go but forward, so they kept slogging forward. When scouts reported that Burgoyne's army was finally getting close, General Schuyler pulled back even further south, and on July the 30th, Burgoyne's army finally emerged from the woods at Fort Edward, and they were in bad shape when they got there. Though they had started off stocked to the gills, supplies were now running low, as there had been no ready access to local sources of anything that an army needs. The commander of the Hessians recommended that Burgoyne allow him to lead a party east to the Connecticut River to forage, but Burgoyne sat on the idea. Better to wait and figure out where Howe was before they started making drastic moves. But on August the 3rd, Burgoyne got the news. Howe had long since put to sea on his way to Philadelphia. What? So let's work through this a little bit, because obviously we've got a massive case of miscommunication on our hands. There are 3 parties involved in this massive case of miscommunication, 2 of whom you already know, General Burgoyne and General Howe. But then there's also Lord George Germain, Secretary of State for American Affairs in the British Ministry, and basically the guy running the war back in London. The order of events goes something like this. After chasing Washington out of New York in late 1776, Howe sent Germain a letter making all kinds of bold proposals about the next year's campaigning, including sending a 10,000-man expedition up the Hudson River. But shortly thereafter, Howe abandoned the idea and sent Germain a revised plan for 1777 that no longer involved any such Hudson River expedition. Amazingly, Germain had this letter in hand in February when he approved Burgoyne's plan to come down from Canada, which at least tacitly assumed some kind of support from Howe. Then, over the next few months, Germain sent Howe at least 8 letters within which he mentioned not once that Burgoyne would shortly be marching down from Canada. Howe was left completely in the dark about those plans, though it is worth noting that Howe didn't really go out of his way to ask. The British, no less than the Americans, were plagued by rivalries between their senior commanders. Howe had no interest in playing a supporting role in Gentleman Johnny's great triumph. In an interesting little twist to all this, Germain was in every way socially and politically inferior to Howe, which may have played a role in him not doing the super obvious thing and ordering Howe to help Burgoyne. So with the right hand, not knowing what the left hand was doing because the guy in between wasn't telling them, Howe sailed off for Philadelphia while Burgoyne was busy hacking his way through the forests of upstate New York. In terms of strategic coordination, the British campaigns of 1777 are an all-time great fail. While Burgoyne pondered what the hell he was going to do next, the Continental Congress was wondering the same thing. Because though the tactical reasons for just abandoning Ticonderoga had been obvious, when word got out that the fort had been given up without a fight, it caused quite an uproar in the Congress. This, coupled with further reports from disgruntled underlings about bad morale and constant retreating, convinced them that it was time to sack General Schuyler. On August the 4th, they ordered Horatio Gates, who just happened to be hanging around passing along reports from disgruntled underlings, to go take command of the Northern Department. Gates showed up just in time to start getting credit for the death spiral of Gentleman Johnny's no longer that much of a party train. Burgoyne finally decided to send a detachment of 600 Hessians east to forage for supplies, but on August 16th, these Hessians were surrounded at Bennington by an American force twice their size and mowed down. When word of this disaster got back to Burgoyne, even the false bravado deserted him. Still on the east side of the Hudson, he decided all he could do now was make a run for Albany. But to get there, he would have to cross the Hudson, and the place he elected to make that crossing was at Saratoga. Meanwhile, out west, that diversionary force of 2,000 men, 1,000 of which were Allied Indians, was making their own way towards Albany. They had sailed up the St. Lawrence River, crossed Lake Ontario, and put to shore just about due west of Burgoyne's position on July the 25th. On August the 2nd, they laid siege to the Americans guarding Fort Stanwix on the Mohawk River. An American militia force with a contingent of their own Indian allies marched to relieve Stanwix, but they were surprised at Oriskany. The resulting battle was bloody for both sides, but in the end the Americans managed to hold the field, though they were also forced to pull back due to heavy casualties. A few days later, Benedict Arnold talked General Schuyler, who did not yet know he had been relieved of his command, into letting Arnold take 800 Continentals in relief of Fort Stanwix. But when he arrived in the vicinity a few weeks later, he failed to convince the local militiamen to join the effort. Most of them had fought at Oriskany, and frankly, wanted no more to do with any of this. So Arnold let a captured loyalist escape back to the British, with the false report that a huge relief army was on the way and that it would be there any minute. This convinced the Iroquois, who were allied with the British and who had already borne the brunt of the fighting, to say, okay, we're done here, taking almost all the supplies with them. This forced the British contingent to make their own retreat, and Arnold hustled back east for the coming battles at Saratoga. With no relief coming from any direction, Burgoyne's men built a bridge across the Hudson in early September and crossed over. Horatio Gates, meanwhile, had parlayed his own popularity with the rank and file and the victory at Bennington and the murder of Jane McCrae into an army that now numbered 6,000 or 7,000, with more volunteer militiamen pouring in every day. While Burgoyne crossed the Hudson on September the 13th, Gates was 10 miles south, fortifying an east-west line at Bemis Heights, a set of steep hills that ran right up against the Hudson. It was the perfect wall to block Burgoyne if he did the obvious thing and followed the river south, which Burgoyne is about to do, though he did have the foresight to divide his men into 3 columns to at least make things interesting. 5 days later, light skirmishing between the two sides gave hints as to Burgoyne's strategy, which was not a bad one because, Burgoyne has made a lot of unforced errors, but he was a really good field commander, and his strategy was to send down a column of Hessians to flank the American left and then crush the rebels against the river. On September 19th, the first of the 2 full-scale battles that have been mashed together by history into the Battle of Saratoga, broke out about a mile north of Bemis Heights. Benedict Arnold, back now with the main army and in command of that all-important American left, begged Gates to let him advance so they wouldn't get trapped on the heights. Finally, at noon, Gates decided to let Arnold go, and Arnold either sent, or led himself, there appears to be some dispute about this, a portion of his troops down from the heights, including a now legendary company of sharpshooters. These troops finally encountered what turned out to be the middle column of the British advance at a clearing in the woods next to Freeman's farm. This clearing was about 350 yards wide, the British controlling the north tree line and the Americans the south. The mutual attacks got going right away, with each side advancing into the clearing to try to drive the other side back. But this turns out to be just about as effective as your standard issue World War I senseless slaughter. Both sides just got mowed down in turn, especially the British, who were getting picked off with terrifying ease by the American sharpshooters. One British company started the day with 350 men. By the end of the battle, they were down to just 60. The Battle of Freeman's Farm was finally called on account of darkness and the arrival of some Hessian reinforcements. Arnold ordered his men to fall back. So this all turns out a little bit like Bunker Hill. The British win a tactical victory. They controlled the field, but only after taking heavy casualties, almost 600 dead. After everything is taken into account since Burgoyne left Canada, the dead, the wounded, the sick, the missing, the deserted, the left behind, the British were now down to just 5,000 men. Down in the American camp, the senior commanders capitalized on Burgoyne's difficulties by getting in a huge fight with each other over who should get credit for Freeman's Farm. Because when Gates sent his report to the Congress, he did not even mention Benedict Arnold. As you can imagine, Arnold was pretty ticked off about it. A yelling match between the two men resulted in Arnold demanding a transfer and Gates granting it. But critically, Arnold did not immediately pack up and leave. This will be really important in a second. But though the American officers were at each other's throats, they were enjoying a massive influx of new recruits. There's nothing like a good bandwagon to hop onto, and with word of Burgoyne's plight spreading across the countryside, every man with a musket rushed in to help finish him off. Soon, Gates was in charge of something like 11,000 men. But Burgoyne was not done yet. He was gearing up for another advance a few days later when a letter arrived from Henry Clinton of all people, hinting that he might be able to show up and bail Burgoyne out because Clinton had stayed behind in New York when Howe sailed away. This letter obviously picked up Burgoyne's flagging spirits, but unfortunately by the time he got the letter, Clinton had already decided that such a move was totally unfeasible. After a few weeks hunkered down in a hastily fortified camp waiting for Clinton, Burgoyne finally realized that he had to advance or surrender. So on October the 7th, he advanced. He led a task force of 1,600 men down to investigate the possibility of breaking through what Burgoyne believed now marked the far left of the American line. But it wasn't the far left. There was an even further left, and among them were those legendary sharpshooters. With Arnold relieved of duty, Gates now commanded the left flank personally, and he sent those sharpshooters to swing around behind the advancing British task force, while he sent 2 other strong columns to hold down the middle and the right. Burgoyne had not really been expecting this kind of response. He wasn't even planning to fight until the next morning, but now he was pinned down. After an hour of listening to the intense fighting, the relieved of duty and very possibly drunk Benedict Arnold decided he couldn't take it anymore, and he rode down to join the fray. When he arrived, he rallied the faltering American middle into forcing the British back towards their fortified camp, which was protected by 2 redoubts. Running a very fine line between bravery and insanity, Arnold charged after them and his men followed. The battle then moved on to those 2 redoubts, and Arnold recklessly charged around, seemingly oblivious to the fact that he really ought to be riddled with bullets by now. Though it was not easy, the Americans finally broke through the fortifications that guarded the British camp, but not before Arnold was finally hit in the leg, and he had to be carted off the field. Burgoyne's battered army might have surrendered right then and there, but darkness forced the Americans to hold off on delivering the final blow. So Benedict Arnold was in every way the hero of the Saratoga campaign, starting with the little trick that forced the British to pull back from Fort Stanwix, to correctly identifying and then parrying Burgoyne's thrust at Freeman's Farm, and now obviously here at the somewhat erroneously labeled Battle of Bemis Heights. And that's not even counting his little naval campaign on Lake Champlain that forced the British to put their invasion plans off for a year. It has been mentioned by historians more than once that had Arnold been killed leading that final charge, he would have gone down as one of the most beloved men in American history. Instead, he lived long enough to go down as one of the most hated. Burgoyne was able to pull his battered forces back to Saratoga on October the 9th, but by the 12th, Gates had moved in and cut off the British from the Hudson River, so on October the 16th, a conference was held in Saratoga to discuss terms. Terms, by the way, that would soon be countermanded by Congress as excessively lenient. On October the 17th, 1777, General John Burgoyne, in one of those snappy uniforms he had brought along, formally surrendered himself and the 5,800 men he had left. Adding up everybody that had been killed, wounded, gone missing, deserted, or was now captured, Burgoyne had lost 9,000 men since leaving Canada. News of this crushing defeat sent shockwaves across Europe. King George refused to believe it. The ministry was in a state of shock and now under heavy fire for botching the war. Down on the continent, the French finally had the proof they had been looking for, that the Americans were capable of winning the war, if they had a little extra help. Next time, the war will shift into its next phase, as the British try to regroup and refocus, and Benjamin Franklin successfully talks the French into joining the war. I say next time because I'm going to have to take a week off. Mrs. Revolutions will be out of town, and I will have sole custody of a 2-year-old. If I survive, we'll be back in 2 weeks to start turning our attention to the southern colonies, where the British ministry hoped to revive a war effort that had suddenly become a quagmire.